Hello there. Welcome to my weekly meditation. And know that no matter who you are or where you are in your life journey, you are welcome in this place. This is a weekly video that I do for my congregation in South Burlington. And so if you are looking to nurture a progressive faith and you find this video helpful, please feel free to like, subscribe, or share these videos with anyone you feel called to. Our reading for today comes from Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 through 21. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. He looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves, and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were 5,000 men, besides which were also women and children. All right, so this week we're talking about Matthew 14, and we're talking about the feeding of the 5,000, or the 4,000, or the more thousand. Counts differ depending on which gospel you're reading, and while those differing accounts definitely point out that we were not there, we don't really know what happened, I don't think that that diminishes the fact that what we're talking about here is a miracle that Jesus facilitated. Jesus used his God powers to give to us, and how we are going to perceive that, how we're going to translate that into the world today, differs based off of how we want to perceive this miracle. Traditionally, this is a story where people in church say that God blessed these 5 loaves of bread and these 2 fish, and so that the thousands of people could all eat their fill from them. I think that that is one way in which you can perceive the account, but I think that the other thing that we can read into when it comes to this story is that Jesus facilitated a moment of sharing. And I would argue that this was not something that Jesus just did on his own, but rather it was a moment of sharing that Jesus opened up for the thousands of people that were there with him, and a miracle did occur. And that miracle was that people truly understood what Jesus was teaching in that moment, and they lived into that spirit of generosity, hospitality, and giving that Jesus was preaching. And so let's talk a little bit about that. So what I mean when I say that I feel Jesus started a moment of sharing is that when we look at this passage from Matthew 14, it focuses a lot on Jesus. It doesn't focus a lot on what the crowd is doing. We hear from the crowd that it was men, women, and children. In this particular passage, they counted the men, they didn't count the women. And especially when we hear the different accounts from the Gospels, it's like, well, maybe it was 4,000, maybe it was 5,000, maybe it was who knows. The focus really is on Jesus, and a little bit on Jesus' disciples, but even then, we're not hearing too much from his disciples other than the fact that they're passing out bread and fish. So where the miracle is happening is not something that the author of this gospel is paying attention to. We're all focused on Jesus. And I think that that is a bit of a disservice, because as followers of Jesus Christ, we're not just trying to understand what Jesus preaches, we're trying to understand how people receive it. And I think that what we're really missing here is the impact of Jesus' teachings about social equality. And how it would have affected this crowd of 5,000-6,000 people. I think there is a reasonable explanation as to why everybody was fed in this crowd, and it is a miracle. And the miracle is that people listened to Jesus. These are not people who would have shown up to hear Jesus preach without food. Some would have, but I don't think many would have had it escape their notice that if they're going to be spending a day listening to this person preach, they would need to feed themselves, they would need to feed their families. And so we know that in these type of gatherings, especially in the first century, people brought food with them. It was a valuable resource, especially if you were poor. But I also think that it is true that there would have been many who were following Jesus who were struggling. And when Jesus offered the 5 loaves of bread that he had and the fish, what he really was doing was sending a message to the crowd. I am going to share what I have, and by the laws of hospitality that were commonplace in Jesus' time, others would have followed in his example. I think that what Jesus did was he gave the crowd that was gathered around him an opportunity to not just listen to his message, but to live into his message. And within the crowd, there were those who needed food, and they probably were able to turn to a neighbor who had food in abundance, and they were able to share it. And there were those who had gifts that they could share, and they were able to find a person in need, and they too were able to give that gift. It was a moment where people were able to come together and really see the way in which this community that is rooted in God's love is able to work and actually function and actually heal the world. I think it was a brilliant move on Jesus' part. It was an opportunity for him to move his sermon from the realm of parable and metaphor to something tangible and real that people could enact and understand. And unfortunately, that is not something that we get in this gospel, because the intention of this gospel is to elevate Jesus to a divine status. And while I do definitely feel that Jesus speaks with the authority of the divine, I do think that when we are unable to see how the divine call of God's love is able to change us into loving people, that's a disservice. And so, while I can't say with any real authority that that is what happened, that people chose to share and live into Jesus' message, I think many within the tradition who read this passage just assume that that is what happened. And it is generally accepted by many, especially within more progressive churches, that these 5,000, 6,000, 4,000 people shared their food with one another. And they also shared it with Christ, giving Jesus and his disciples more food than they had when they had initially started passing things around. That is a totally acceptable interpretation, I feel, of this passage. And I think that it doesn't diminish the miracle at all, because we struggle to live into that spirit of giving. We struggle to give folks who need our help gifts of love that are useful. And we also struggle to ask for help when we need it. An example, and I need to give this example because for the past couple of half an hour or hour or so, I've been asking myself, does Jesus do things like empty out hundreds of soda cans so that you can use the aluminum for recycling? We had this interesting thing happen at our doorstep a couple of weeks back, where there were these 2 cases that were left right there in front of the church, and they were just filled with this off-brand soda, and none of us knew what to do with it, so we sort of left it sitting around for a little while, hoping that somebody would take it. And I think that that honestly was the reason why it ended up on our church's doorsteps. This was something that somebody had. They didn't know what to do with it, And so they thought to themselves, well, if I give it to a church, then maybe it'll be used for some good. I think that in this example, we have something that we can examine when it comes to this story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 people. Because when Jesus offered up those 5 loaves of bread and those fish, what he was offering was what he and his disciples had to eat. He was offering it to 5,000 people who would likely consume all of it. And there was a real chance that Jesus and his disciples would have been left with nothing for that evening. But instead, what won out within that crowd of people was the generosity and love of God. And folks were able to recognize a need to give what was valuable to their neighbors, to give them nourishment and sustenance. And I think that there is a trend when it comes to our giving in the world today where there are things that we're willing to give that are not important to us, and there are things that we struggle to give that are important to us. And that is something that I think we need to reflect on, especially when it comes to Christian giving. Jesus gave what was important to him. He gave up his own food. He gave up his own life in order to show us a type of loving spirit that can actually have an impact on the world. And there are people in which that message has resonated. But I think that we need to recognize how difficult it is for that message to really find root inside of our hearts. How often are we willing to give up something that's important to us? Now, an entire crate of soda might be important to some folks, but I get the feeling that in the case of our congregation, that was not so much of a gift as it was dumping a problem on our doorstep. And we need to recognize that in Christian community, we will accept your problems and we will accept your gifts. But those are two different things. And I think we need to be aware of when it is we approach a neighbor asking them to share our problems, and when it is we approach a neighbor wanting to offer them our gifts. Because if you're just going to dump a bunch of sodas on the doorstep of a church and be like, oh, I'm doing good for the world, well, you could be doing worse, but you could be doing better. Because really what you're doing is you're making it so a minister has to spend an hour or two dumping out soda cans so that that gift can be turned into something good. And so what are you really giving as a gift? You're not really giving us a choice as to whether or not we want to dump out soda cans for several hours. You're more of giving us a chore. Whereas if you approach a brother or a sister and say, look, I have this problem. I have all this soda. I would like to use it for good. Would you help me? I think that that is a very different type of scenario. It's a scenario where you recognize a challenge, you ask for help, and then you give people the opportunity to give you that help. There is no problem with offering your problems, just as there is no problem with offering your gifts. Sometimes your gifts will be received, sometimes they might be rejected. Sometimes your problems may be received, sometimes they may be rejected. But in the spirit of giving, I think we need to recognize that a real gift is a gift of love that's important to you. And that's what Jesus was doing here. He was giving up his own food. He was showing people through action how we can sustain one another in this planet. We are really struggling with sustainability in this world. We are struggling to feed people, and a lot of that is because many of us hoard. more than we need, when we could be sharing with those who have nothing. If we are to learn from Jesus, I think we need to pay attention. We need to recognize that what Jesus is doing here with this feeding of the 5, 6, 4,000 is he's criticizing our assumptions on scarcity. He is showing us that if we are actually willing to put in the effort of sharing what's important to us, we may just find there are more resources in this world to help each other than we initially thought. If you're willing to put forward a real gift of love, if you're willing to let love guide you to help a neighbor out, if you're willing to let love guide you to ask a neighbor for help, what Jesus is trying to tell us is that God's love will provide. Amen.